Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 at AP English, and we turn now in our study of novels to James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This Bildungsroman novel, we've been using this term Bildungsroman, let's put it in our notes one more time. Bildungsroman, that German word that means the journey of a youth from adolescence into adulthood. We immediately think of Telemachus and the Odyssey, don't we, and Homer's Odyssey, but we'll have a whole lot of other titles that come to mind as well. And even in our study of Jane Eyre, you'll remember that we played around with the notion that a Bildungsroman novel could actually be about a girl and not just a young man. In Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, though, we're going to get the classic, the quintessential Bildungsroman novel of the 20th century, and without doubt, one of the most important novels of the 20th century, published in 1916. At the end of the 20th century, they made a list of the most important 100 novels. To make this list, obviously, labeled you as one of the greatest of all time. James Joyce's Ulysses was number 1. His Portrait of an Artist was number 5. This dude makes it into the top 5 twice. Okay? Dominating, obviously, then everything we're going to say about great writers. I mean, pretty much it's a slam dunk to argue that if you want to talk about prose stylists in fiction, it's probably James Joyce is the most influential of the 20th century. And to that degree, deserving maybe at least of a bit of our scrutiny. Now again, I'm going to make the argument, don't just take my word for it. Obviously, you're going to pick up the novel and try and read it on your own. Maybe you can figure out what's going on with Joyce. Think about this date, 1922. That's a huge date because that's the year that James Joyce will publish Ulysses. And ever after, June 16th is Bloomsday. It becomes like this really important moment in time. The novel is banned, for reasons we'll get into in a moment. Ulysses is banned for a number of years in America. I mean, you get off the boat in New York City, you'd get arrested for having this book in your belongings. Dude, what's up with that? Okay, it was a different time, obviously, 1922. The other important reason why 1922 is written in your notes is, of course, that's the year that T.S. Eliot will publish The Wasteland, considered the greatest poem of the 20th century. So 1922 is an important year in the history of the 20th century, no question. Now, we've said this before, but we've got to come back to it in our conversation of Joyce, and it runs something like this. Who are the thinkers that were most influential on the 20th century? That is to say, before the 20th century began, 1900, 1901, who are the 3 thinkers that probably most greatly influenced the thinking of the 20th century? And I'll even throw in a 4th one after I get done with the Holy Trinity, the big 3. The first, without question, is Darwin. I mean, think about this. 1859, what's Darwin say in his Origin of Species? Well, he says basically all of life is this incredible biological struggle or contest between species as they struggle to somehow survive. Friction, conflict, contest. That's what existence is all about for Darwin. Marx comes along in 1848 and the years to follow. And Marx will say, well, it is true what Darwin says. Life is about incredible biological struggle. But even more importantly, life is about economic struggle, publishing Communist Manifesto in 1848. And in that moment, Marx will put a layer over the Darwinian argument that as true as Darwin is, no question, it's about biology and the struggle of biology. It's that economic struggle that's really got to define how we read history. And of course, Hegel will come along to kind of follow up on that notion. We've had a lot to say about this, haven't we, already? The third of our theorists, though, and so important for our study of Joyce, is Sigmund Freud, the great Viennese psychiatrist, who in 1900 publishes his interpretation of dreams. And in this moment, here's what Freud says. Freud says, you know what? Darwin's right. I mean, obviously there's struggle within this species, the biological species. And Marx is clearly right. I mean, there's obviously some class and economic struggles. But what really is going on as primary conflict is the conflict of the mind or the psyche. He argued that if we stepped inside of one of your brains and we were to read your thoughts the way you can read that ticker tape at the bottom of ESPN when they start running stuff along the bottom, you know, to show scores or whatever. If we could read the thoughts of an individual in this room, we would say about this individual several things, at least 3 things Freud said. 1, the first thing he said is that ticker tape that runs along the bottom of your TV screen of your mind, not one, but a multiplicity of these kinds of things running, right? And those thoughts seem to kind of group around several major things. One strand of thinking, constantly anxiety. Worry, 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 doing Wally hands for those of you. Worry, worry, not sure, always wondering, which is why some of us will have our hands in our mouth or pens in our mouth and that kind of thing, because we're constantly worried. We're worried all the time. Of course, the greatest worry is the fact that we know we ain't met no 200-year-old people. Death, for Freud, is the source of tremendous fear and anxiety. But there's another strand that runs, and that's the aggressive strand. That's the one that says, I'd like to pick up a bat and go find people and just bash them over the heads because I'm enraged all the time. But of course, I'm acculturated to not do this. And so Freud said that my aggressive tendencies can become sublimated, because obviously I'm not allowed to go up and just bash people over the head with a bat, sublimated in fascinating ways. For example, really, as someone I know closely likes to point out, a bunch of grown men being paid billions of dollars to run a stupid little ball across a white line. Are you serious with me right now? And people pay money to watch this and get all excited about this? I mean, if you go to a Broncos game, you walked up to somebody and they're jumping up and down because somebody scored. Wait, that doesn't happen in a Broncos. No, I'm kidding. You know, you would possibly say to them, right? Dude, this is silliness. Why are you getting so worked up over some stupid game? Freud said this is the way we sublimate a lot of our emotional states, especially those kind of aggressive states. We watch other people be aggressive, and somehow for us, it's a way to get it out, if you got me. There's a third strand, and this is what made Freud, of course, really famous, and it's what made Joyce very dangerous. And that is, we're constantly thinking about sex. Not just some of us, all of us. All the time, this strand is constantly there. Now, it's less than what you might think. It goes back to Darwin in many ways. Why do we think about sex? Because the species could go away. I mean, you gotta have sex to have kids. You gotta have kids to survive as a species. So we're constantly concerned about this issue of sexuality as well. And how that evolves and how that develops for Freud is a very interesting idea. It begins in childhood, and then there's this phase through adolescence, this idea, that you begin to have some kind of sense of what's going on physiologically, emotively, sexually with your body. For Freud, this is constant, and it's always happening, always going on. That is to say, Freud said that the psyche or the mind is like that disgusting river outside of town, the Bighorn River. If you go and you look at that river, you would argue that river, it's kind of interesting. I mean, you do have the surface, and you can see the surface, but there's all that stuff that's underneath, all the interesting stuff underneath, all the stuff that's back in, all the stuff that's under the mud, etc., etc. And that notion of the mind as a river or a stream of consciousness is the term that will get used, so put that one in your notes, a stream of consciousness. That river represents symbolically what's going on in the mind all the time. In other words, if we were to say about any one of you, oh, I see you're thinking this right now or thinking that right now, 90% or more of the time you would say, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. We'd be saying, like, look, dude, we're reading it. You're thinking it right now. In other words, Freud argued that you have lots and lots of thoughts, most of which you do not know or understand or appreciate. They are unconscious. He didn't use the term subconscious. Unconscious. Okay? That is to say, you're not aware of them. And yet he said this, and this is hypercritical for a study of Joyce. He said, all actions are motivated by psychic kinds of activity that's going on. So for example, when you do the things you do, and somebody asks you why, Freud says most of the time you don't have a real good answer for that. But, and this is where psychotherapy comes into play for Freud, psychoanalysis as he called it. If you can sit and talk to an individual about actions, you can track back motivations, most of which will begin in early childhood. That is to say, stuff went down in your formative years that formed who you are and what you are. Now, we know that's true nutritionally, right, for example, physiologically, but it's also true psychically. This idea had a prodigious influence on the 20th century, especially among artists. For example, artists ask simple questions like this. I wonder if I could tell a story. For example, there you are standing with your date right before you go down that, that pathway with Mr. Durr ready to read out the names. Homecoming. Not homecoming, prom. Let's do the big one, prom. So there you are, you're standing there, right? Okay, and you're 3 away, and then Mr. Durr calls their names, and then they go, and then calls the next, and then you step up. And of course you're kind of a little bit, okay, I just don't want to fall and make a fool of myself. All the stuff that's going on in your mind. What if we were to describe all of that? Not from the outside, you're just standing there, but from what's going on the inside, what you're thinking, what you're feeling. And what if we were to describe that in words? That attempt to capture psychically what's going on is what we call stream of consciousness, experimentalism, modernism. Joyce is the greatest of these writers, along with a few others like Faulkner and Virginia Woolf. Okay. So Joyce, for example, asks this question: I wonder if I could tell the story of one man's psychic day, one day, June the 16th, one day. And the hero of that novel, Bloom, will go through his entire day, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell about the stuff he thinks. What would a novel like that look like? Well, one day, 800 pages. One day. James Joyce's Ulysses. Of course, he's going to describe everything this cat's thinking. So, for example, he's standing in line in a butcher shop, and he's waiting to get his meat, and a young girl walks in, and he looks at her for all of maybe 2 minutes, and then she leaves. But we got 40 pages about all the stuff that he's thinking about. See how this works? And of course, some of this stuff, obviously it's going to be stuff that, well, we just listed it in your notes. It's going to be stuff about anxieties. It's going to be stuff about aggression. It's going to be stuff about sexuality. And guess what? In 1922, you're not supposed to write about stuff like that. But Joyce was even more innovative than that. He wanted to take the perspective, for example, of presenting storylines without saying stuff. For example, he knows he's going to have this war hero who's giving a speech, and right in the middle of the speech, the war hero is going to let one rip, because earlier in the day he had a meal of beans. But Joyce doesn't want to say that the guy let one rip. All Joyce does across the page is to spell out in letters this sound. He spent weeks coming up with the proper letters to put in order, so that you're reading and all of a sudden you see all this string of letters. You're like, what is going on? And then it hits you. Oh, dude, the old man is standing in front of a bunch of people, and while he's giving his speech, he just starts ripping it, which is obviously hilarious, okay, although some people thought this was obscene, right, kind of thing. He has a whole chapter, for example, that's interior monologue, but there's no punctuation. Well, you don't think in punctuation. You know what I'm saying? You don't think with periods and question marks. I just said, you know what I'm saying? It's not like I said, you know what I'm saying, question mark. You know what I'm saying? Right? So he writes without any punctuation for over 50 pages with only one period. Of course, the problem with reading that kind of thing is, when does one thought stop and the next thought begins? And of course, depending on where you pick up the reading, the words put in order this way will have different kind of meanings contingent upon where you decide to pause. Experimental. Brief bio of Joyce before we get into now Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. We do already have on LearnStrong.net a lecture over James Joyce's Araby, A-R-A-B-Y, in the LearnStrong.net folders, and I've given some biographic information there on Joyce, so I'm just going to be really kind of cursory here with you guys. Born 2nd of February 1882, dies the 13th of January 1941. Born in Dublin, in Ireland, and said, I always write about Dublin. And he argued that even after he left and went to the continent to live for most of the rest of his life, Dublin was in his bones, in his body, and he always was talking about his youth and experience in Dublin. In his early 20s, he immigrates to Europe. He says in Portrait of the Artist that Ireland is like a sow that eats its own piglets. It eats up its artists. It destroys them. And Joyce left and, for all intents and purposes, kind of renounced his Irish citizenship. The question of James Joyce, especially in Portrait of the Artist, is this question, so I want you to write it down. Question: are artists born or are they made? Are artists born or are they made? Is there something fundamentally different about the way an artist sees the world? Is an artist born? Or can you just wake up some morning and say, you know what, I'm going to be an artist in my life. That's what I'm going to do, and try and learn how to be an artist. James Joyce is going to argue artists are born. They are fundamentally different from other kinds of people on the planet. And because of that, there's both good and bad. Joyce was very influenced by a French symbolist poet named Baudelaire. And since we're here, I just want to introduce you to a couple of Baudelaire poems real fast, okay? Now, the first one is called To the Reader. This is the opening poem of The Flowers of Evil. And you can hear in that title already what is coming. This is a little ditty that runs something like this. To the Reader is the way that Baudelaire, and this is a translation by the great Stanley Kuntz. Ignorance, error, cupidity, and sin possess our souls and exercise our flesh. Habitually, we cultivate remorse as beggars entertain and nurse their lice. Our sins are stubborn. Cowards when contrite, we overpay confession with our pains, and when we're back again in human mire, vile tears we think will wash away our stains. Thrice potent Satan in our cursed bed lulls us to sleep, our spirit overkissed, until the precious metal of our will is vaporized, the cunning alchemist. Who but the devil pulls our waking strings? Abominations lure us to their side. Each day we take another step to hell, descending through the stench, unhorrified. Like an exhausted rake who mouths and chews the martyrized breast of an old withered whore, we steal in passing whatever joys we can, squeezing the driest orange all the more. Packed in our brains, incestuous as worms, our demons celebrate in drunken gangs, and when we breathe, that hollow rasp is death sliding invisibly down into our lungs. If the dull canvas of our wretched life is unembellished with such petty ware as knives or poison, pyromania, rape, it's because our soul's too weak to dare. But in this den of jackals, monkeys, curs, scorpions, buzzards, snakes, this paradise of filthy beasts that screech, howl, grovel, grunt, in this menagerie of mankind's vice, there's one supremely hideous and impure, soft-spoken, not the type to cause a scene. He'd willingly make rubble of the earth and swallow up creation in a yawn. I mean ennui, the French word for boredom. Who in his hookah dreams produces hangmen and real tears together? How well you know this fastidious monster. Reader, hypocrite reader, you, my double, my brother. You, the French, you hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. This idea that we are somehow able to equate with the writer of this really kind of disgustingly disturbing poetry. He says, let me tell you about what we really are. We're vermin. We're disgusting. And here's the thing. We know that we are, which is why we love to sin, so that we can feel all guilty about it, so we can turn around and ask for forgiveness, so we can do it all over again. Hurrah. Ooh, let's put it in our notes. Baudelaire, pretty dark. Very influential in the thinking of Joyce, however. But the poem I want to go to for Baudelaire is his great The Albatross. Now, we know about the albatross because we studied Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, that large bird that can fly for miles and miles over the ocean. In The Albatross, this is a short poem by Baudelaire and very influential in the thinking of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This is what he says. This is the word picture. Watch this one. Oftentimes, for diversion, seafaring men capture albatross, those vast birds of the seas that accompany at languorous pace boats plying their way through bitter straits. Having scarce been taken aboard, these kings of the blue, awkward and shy, piteously their great white wings let droop like oars at their sides. This winged voyager, how clumsy he is and weak. He just now so lovely, how comic and ugly. One with a stubby pipe teases his beak, another mimics, limping, the cripple who could fly. The poet resembles this prince of the clouds, who laughs at hunters and haunts the storms, exiled to the ground amid the jeering pack. His giant wings will not let him walk. Let's say three things quickly about this poem. One, Baudelaire says that the poet is like an albatross. When flying through the air, majestic, beautiful, but on the ground, looks kind of clumsy and silly. They got those, the albatross got those large wings, they kind of almost drag along the ground. Number two, he says about poets, artists, that normal people can't appreciate them, understand them, relate to them. And finally, number three, even more disturbingly, they have a tendency to do terrible things to them, like what? Crucify them, put a bullet through them if we're talking now Martin Luther King Jr. Think about the ways in which the bringers of knowledge and light, poets, are often ridiculed, maligned, misunderstood. For Joyce, that is no throwaway. That's significant. And in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he's going to play that game out by telling in many ways his own autobiography. Now, this is semi-autobiographic, but a whole lot of the events of this novel are going to come right out of Joyce's own biography. Let's pause for a moment now and come to Joyce and the understanding of adolescence. One of the reasons why this book becomes so fascinating to read as a young person is that Joyce tries to describe what it's like to go through adolescence. What is adolescence? Well, educational psychologists will often point out, ostensibly, there's kind of 4 stages of adolescence. There is identity diffusion. You've kind of adopted whatever it is that somebody's given to you as your identity. There's then identity foreclosure, when you begin to kind of think you might maybe ask some questions about who you are. Do you remember middle school where you went in the morning, today I am not going to talk to those people anymore. I'm not even sitting with them. You know, in other words, I'm not going to identify myself in this way anymore. Or I'm not going to dress the way I used to dress. I'm dressing and you begin to challenge, but it's that 3rd stage in adolescence, moratorium is what it's called, the crisis of identity. That's the pivotal moment. For Joyce, that we will refer to as epiphany, sudden insight, illumination, something you come to understand that you never can unlearn it. It forever changes kind of the way you see the world, the way you think about the world. Culminating with inner identity achievement, where finally the crisis is somehow reshaped and you become kind of the individual that you are. This is what we call the Bildungsroman. That is to say, you go through a series of experiences that somehow produce this thing called you. And it's funny to ask the question, you're not the same you were when you walked into this building 4 years ago. I wonder what kind of you'll be in 4 years then. I mean, think about that. If you've evolved, not just physiologically, emotively, right, in all other ways, in the last 4 years, I wonder what in 4 years you'll look like. How will you be different, though, psychically? How will you see the world differently? How will you think differently? That evolution into adulthood has a lot to do for Joyce with what's happening in your high school years and, of course, the few years to follow high school. Now, our assumptions here as we go into this novel is, obviously, you know our learning theory, that connecting new information to old information in meaningful ways. Obviously, you're paying attention to our annotative process and the 3 levels of reading. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? And 2A, themes, messages. Along with our big 5, that is to say, that discussion of what does this novel say about epistemology, what you can know, ontology and who you are, psychology, we've already